It is such an honor to be here, and thank you so much to Emily and all the others who put in all the work for making an event like this happen, because I think we all know by now just how complex that is. And thanks for all the great energy that I've been able to absorb just while waiting on the sidelines here. So a little bit of context here. I'm a cognitive psychologist by training, as you might have picked up from the introduction and a little bit of the what you heard about from my background. And you're going to see a lot of that context and background come through in some of the ideas I'm going to share with you today. And so there's been a whole lot of interest really over the last 5 to 10 years in higher education and in K through 12 education and lifelong education as well, in applying the particular frameworks and concepts from that area of psychology to learning. And so you probably will be familiar with quite a few of the concepts here that we'll talk about here today. But even if you kind of have them all down pat and they're all quite familiar to you, I think what you'll come away with are some ideas that will spark your creativity and ideas about how to apply some of these concepts in new ways to address some teaching dilemmas and push back against some of the hardest kind of challenges that we face in teaching psychology, and in teaching all kinds of other disciplines as well. And this is also designed to carry over very much into the discussions that you'll be having with your master teachers later on. So that's intentional as well. We're hoping to spark some of those conversations too. Okay, with that bit of brief context, we're going to start with a little demonstration, a little activity. So for those of you who are able to engage in this, great. If not, you'll still be able to get some of the big concepts. Now, you will need to be at a desk. I'm glad to see so far I haven't seen anybody coming through Zoom while they're driving. So that's a good thing. Most of you are at a desk. You are going to need a very specific technology. It is one that has been discussed before in this already, and that is a piece of paper and a writing implement. So if you have this, antiquated technology at the ready, get it ready. Hopefully you already does. Some of you are in outer space. I guess you're going to need one of those pens that writes upside down. So, but get those at the ready, because here's what we're going to do. I am going to ask you to sketch something out on this piece of paper. I'm going to ask you to do that from memory. All right. So no referencing any models just yet. What I would like for you to do is, on your piece of antiquated technology, I would like for you to sketch out the front. And if you're feeling really ambitious, you've had your coffee, you can do the back too, any version of a penny, a US 1-cent coin. All right. And here, I'm going to give you about a minute and a half to try to do this. I'm going to be employing the familiar teaching technique known as stalling in the meantime while I give you a little bit of time. I feel like I need Jeopardy music, but Zoom gets really angry when you try to do that. So we will put about 1 minute on the clock and let you attempt to draw this very familiar object from memory. Okay, we are coming up on just about a little over a minute here. So, of course, it's a rapid assessment. We need to know how you did. So, I'll provide a little official example here right up on your screen, but if you've got one handy, ransack your pockets, check the loose drawer, the junk drawer, and say, how did you do? All right. So how did you do? And you may even want to post in chat, was there perhaps anything that was discrepant between your drawing and the real thing? So what, if anything, could have possibly been a little discrepant about your artistic representation of this familiar object which you have in memory? So, okay. Liberty at the bottom. Okay, we know it's in there somewhere, but it floats in there. Oh, kind of drew the back. All right. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a back, and that's very polarizing. Which penny version? Oh, okay. So we've got In God We Trust, but it's in the wrong place. Anybody got Lincoln facing the wrong direction? Wave if you got Lincoln facing the wrong direction. Sometimes people put a hat on him. That's always entertaining, but he's not wearing one in the actual penny. Right, Patricia does the same one because it is a classic, and more on that in a minute, right? So we've got another who's in the wrong direction. Okay, so what we're doing, of course, is replicating this very robust hey, with a mask on. Okay, all right, I don't know about that. That's definitely the pandemic talking right there. The White House in the background. You only got the direction, but every single thing else was off. Yeah, I got to try that with the who's got a mask on Lincoln. So what we're doing is, and if you're like the person who does this in class, you know that this is a very reliable effect. And it's one that was discovered in a much more controlled circumstances by Nickerson and Adams so many years ago. When they did this, and they tried this with other stimuli too. It doesn't have to be a penny. The bottom line being, even though we've seen this thousands of times, even though we kind of conceptually know what it is, we don't probably have a memory representation that's accurate of this. So even though our eyes have been pointed at it many times, it's been in front of us, we've handled it, we don't know. We don't know what a penny looks like. Now, some of you, it sounds like, already do this with your students. So what are, perhaps also drop in chat if you'd like to, what does this tell us, and what might come up if you use this as the basis for discussion in class? So I do this as well. I've done this with many groups, and it's one that I often kick off with as an icebreaker. I have some other twists on this too, which are in Minds Online if you'd like. Yes, they miss almost everything. To remember, you have to pay attention to begin with, right? We see it, it's in front of our eyes, but that is not the same as paying focused attention. Encoding, yes, so it shows it. We don't just sort of record everything like a video camera, a common misconception about memory, right? If we do, we could just kind of rewind the tape and say, okay, what are the details? But we don't. We have to encode it accurately at the beginning in order to do retrieval at the end. Missing the common, right? Quizzing of items they see in the class, but that's a great variation, Carrie. I love that. Right, so as different kinds of encoding. So in a psychology class, you can also kind of take it to that level as well. Right, and so it's not relevant to me. I don't care about pennies. I use my card. What even are these things? The significance with which we imbue things can also affect memory because we aren't video cameras. We're always interpreting. So this is, of course, one kind of framing concepts that we can use to talk to our students and also remind ourselves about all that goes on under the surface with memory, and also some other aspects of cognition when we are learning, when we're getting information from our environment and then using it later on. So that does bring us to this framework of cognition. And so with faculty across disciplines, when I came to say, I would love to take these great concepts and things like the Nickerson and Adams work, I would love to take this and turn it into something that teachers can use and that can help even guide technology choices. What it came down to, this whole vast field that has all this jargon and a lot of dense stuff in it, was really bringing it down to these three facets of cognition, which I think are the most relevant to learning. And again, when we have a framework, sometimes that can actually spark our creativity and let us see teaching problems in new ways. So, and this will become really the basis of the rest of our brief time together, talking about and unpacking in these three areas. So first off, attention. So just like with the penny demonstration shows, in cognition, it's almost like the Forrest Gump of the mind, right? Anytime something interesting is happening or is about to happen, attention has to be on the scene. Memory is unlikely to happen without focused attention. We can quibble a little bit around the edges on that one, but to remember, you have to pay attention. To think, to extend information in new ways, to apply it, you have to pay focused attention. So it's interesting, I think, that not all teaching guides actually even talk about this, but especially post-pandemic, as we saw in the discussion that went on earlier, attention has become a really crucial concept that we discuss in teaching. And then, of course, memory, right? And as we'll get into a little bit with the memory part of this talk, this is not to say that teaching is all about memorization, as we'll touch on in a little bit. This is a really charged subject. However, I think more of us are saying and coming around to, we do want and need students to have some information, a knowledge base that is actually committed to memory. But and that need not actually interfere with or contradict thinking as another very, very important aspect of what we want students to do. So I think for people who, like us, who are in the middle of summer at a teaching conference, we care the most about having students be able to use and think about and think more like experts in the discipline that we're teaching them. And we know, many of us, we either learn it through experience or we know from the research literature that while building a knowledge base in a discipline is important, it isn't sufficient to just suddenly trigger the ability to use psychological knowledge, for example, in the way that a disciplinary expert would. For that, you need practice. So we're going to spend our time looking more deeply into applications of these three big areas. So starting, of course, with that attention component, capturing students' focus, holding it and using it as efficiently as possible. Those are kind of the things we think about when we think about practical applications of concepts and attention in teaching. So how do we do that? Now, as teachers of psychology, that attention is it's a fascinating, but it's a slippery concept. So we don't really even know exactly. There's not like there's one spot in the brain that is attention, and it's even hard to define. But we do know a lot about it, as you know as well. In particular, that attention is all about prioritizing. Right? The brain has limited capacity, limited resources that it can throw at any given processing problem or thing you're trying to do. And so attention is essentially the function of being able to say, well, which of these things, how am I going to divide up those limited resources on a millisecond by millisecond basis? Our brain is doing that. So we know what attention does. We know what it's about. So what could possibly go wrong, right? We all have a good concept of what it means to focus and pay attention, what gets in the way. Now, you probably can, we could certainly set the chat on fire with a few of these ideas, but here are some that I'll put out there that I frequently share with teachers. First of all is, as we say, excessive cognitive load. So that's a whole kind of technical area and talk in and of itself. But some of the really relevant issues are that, and we know from how we design learning experiences, especially those that are fully online, that you have to kind of pull out of the same bucket of cognitive resources for the learning, kind of what's germane for learning, to master the content or learn the new skill, and everything else you have to do to kind of process the environment. So for example, If my homework assignment's over here in the book and I'm trying to use a new spreadsheet over here in the computer and kind of toggle back and forth between those, I have less left over for learning. And we like to talk about that in instructional design because sometimes that's something that we can control as teachers. We can say, you know what, let's get students practiced on how to use the spreadsheet or how to use the chat function or the email system before we have them do that while they're also learning in an assignment. And then there's the automaticity concept, right? So this is one that's been around forever in psychology, and I think it's underutilized in learning, the automaticity idea. So with this idea, you think about, for example, when you learn to drive, or many of your students are learning to drive right now too. So you may use this as an example a lot, that you need everything, all of your cognitive resources to perform all the little subtasks that go into effective driving, right? Over time, things like monitoring your instruments or handling shifting, if you're doing that, those become automatic, and that leaves you more so you can have a conversation, you can monitor the road better, and so on. And I think that this concept also applies to learning, and we'll return to perhaps to this one in a second. So be thinking about how automaticity might also affect learning. Are there things that students have, low-level skills that students haven't mastered yet, that then take away from their ability to attend to some of the higher order things in learning? And then there is something that has already been very prominent in the discussion, what we will call dysfunctional multitasking. A big way to say, yeah, I'm going to learn while I got my phone, I'm texting my 22 friends in the group chat and running a TikTok on the same side and then talking to somebody. And why do people do this? There's lots of reasons why. And now we have all of our devices are engineered to get us to, divide our attention across lots of things. But partly it does come down to mistaken beliefs about attention. Thinking, for example, well, I can sort of pick up in the background anything important and learn while I'm doing something else. If we think that's true, we're more likely to make that choice. So those are some key things about attention. Now, a few tips and ideas, again, to spark creativity that I tend to pass along to teachers. Simply the opportunity to respond. I think we all know this as skilled teachers, but especially when we do go to a new environment like online, remembering that we don't just absorb information, minute after minute after minute, unless we find some way to apply it. That's not what our minds are set up to do. So setting things up so that we do have lots of polls, opportunities to respond, even the good old hand raise. Is critical for focusing attention. Automaticity, and here maybe folks can drop in the chat, are there skills, like lower level skills that students need in order to be successful at higher order assignments that they need to have down pat? Anything that, a skill that can become automatic, and when it does, that leaves a lot more capacity. So anything that people can think of that would work there. Taking even just note-taking techniques, that's a great one. Right. Right. The terminology, that's in a way, that's at least pretty close to the automaticity concept, right? If I have to stop to look something up, then I've kind of derailed the attention there. Right. Language. I know citations when I teach research methods, I don't have to stop to say, oh my gosh, where does the semicolon go when I'm writing a paper? I can try to keep my little train of concept of thought there. My students can't. What can you do about that? Well, I like to piece out those skills and have students practice those very specifically. And then that leaves them more capacity. And then addressing myths. And, it's just beautiful that this has already came up in the little breakout group discussion. Does anybody remember Patricia's point about different ways to show students and not just tell them that your attention is limited? Just because you're young does not mean that you can text your 22 friends, watch a video, and master calculus at the same time. So I wanted to briefly bring up this project. I won't go into in too much depth due to time, but contact me. Oh, yes, we had a request for the last slide. Yes. Got to get the backwards arrow there. There we go. We do have a project that we've been running at Northern Arizona University for several years now called Attention Matters. And it takes that same philosophy that Patricia mentioned of engaging students in, say, showing them one of those great videos about what gets by you when you're distracted. And then they have a discussion about it. And then you ask them to say, okay, what do you do to implement some techniques to make sure your phone is off during class? What can you do if you're being distracted in class? And it gives them some additional study tips and some cognitive principles without a lot of text that they can implement in place of some of these sort of dysfunctional ideas that I can just spread my attention across everything, or that I can passively absorb information. We use the penny demonstration, by the way. Now, if you're interested in these materials, just give me a direct message anytime. And you can also find some of those materials in this free ebook that we put out. We have a chapter in this book a few years ago. So if you want more ideas about how to do that, yeah, the change blindness, that's a big one. Great conversation starter about these issues. Okay, so we're gonna transition though over into the memory, which we know is connected to attention, but springing off of that, how do we get students to build that knowledge base? Now, here again, I want to invite you to drop into chat. What is maybe some pieces of information or concepts that students need to know? They need to not, even though they could, in theory, always go to Google and look it up. What are some things that they had to do, have to remember without looking it up? I've got mine. I know when I teach research methods, I want students to have down cold P equals 0.05, the conventional level of alpha. I want them to not have to go and look that up. It's easy enough to do so, but they need to actually know that. So is there anything that students need to know, need to have down cold in your classes? Okay, correlation and causation, that's a great one. Yeah, that needs to, you need to not look up the definitions. So I think that we'll find in all disciplines, there are these key pieces of information. And this is where, as I mentioned, this can, heritability, perspectives, this is where things can get a little polarizing. And I talk a lot about this in my forthcoming book to kind of defuse a little bit of that pushback that many of us naturally have when we say, well, I don't want my classes to all be about memory and memorization, right? That is a real hot button issue. I know it isn't in higher education. But more of us are saying, you know, in order to have students actually be able to use what they know, in order for them to be able to say, learn how to interpret statistical output or really read in detail a psychology article, they need to know certain things. And so more of us are saying that it can coexist quite nicely with learning to think. And fortunately, we do know so much from the applied side of memory. You don't have to spend the whole class, all of your class time, just on drilling the information. If we focus on the efficiency, that leaves a lot more time in the class to focus on higher order thought processes. Now, of course, when we think about the memory principles from our very own textbooks that matter the most, here are some of the big ones that I think are the most applicable. And these are not going to be big news for most people, but first off is really a mindset shift, right? So instead of thinking of memory as a container or as a recording, as I said, that's a common misconception that our memories are just sort of recording things, or it's a place we can just keep packing information into. To think about it as an adaptation, something our mind is able to do in order for us to accomplish other things, right? And just like the penny demonstration showed, we absorb information in memory when it connects to our goals, what we're trying to do or accomplish at the moment, our context, what we already know, its relevance to ourselves. So when we think about memory in that way and encourage our students to think about memory in that way, a lot of things become really clear, like why we don't remember those details that are not important to us, or why simply highlighting a textbook and sitting in class is not enough to cause that information to really take root. Other important principles, which I know many of you are already familiar with, so I won't talk about too much. Of course, the depth of processing, having students think about information in terms of meaning tends to drive it into memory. Anything that we can visualize tends to be highly memorable. And of course, when we engage with it in a more spaced way, instead of cramming, that also tends to enhance memory. But of course, here's the big star of the last, say, 10 to 20 years of applied memory research in education, which is retrieval practice and the testing effect. So when we actively retrieve information from memory, like there's probably some details of the penny you'll remember better tomorrow because you had to try to remember them today, even if you were wrong. That we know is just about the most effective use of study time that has ever been discovered. So that's a big, big deal. And if you'd like to read more, there's plenty of articles out there on this. Here's just one of my favorites. It really, especially when you put retrieval practice in a head-to-head test against the favored method of many students, which is restudying and rereading, just I'm going to read it again. Retrieval practice just blows it out of the water. And this is, we're not talking about gains that just are little and happen in a laboratory setting. These happen, these hold up over sometimes months, or some people are even saying possibly even years. The advantage of actively pulling information out of memory makes it memorable much longer later on. And, you know, for those of us who are worried about, hey, if I bring in, say, a daily quiz or a weekly quiz, or we play a quiz game, what about test anxiety? Well, there's this interesting suggestion from this research project that came out a little while ago, looking at high school and middle school age students, that they actually had less test anxiety when they had more frequent tests, more frequent quizzes in class that were geared specifically to helping them learn, not just measuring and grading what they knew. So testing for learning, quizzing can decrease test anxiety over time. All right, so a lot of information there, but hopefully some bookmarks for those of you who want to go back and check them out later on. Good, and I see retrieval practice, great one. I know we're running a little short on time here, so points here. I do think that if we are not using quizzing in our and retrieval practice in our technology choices and our instructional design, we are missing out and our students are missing out. So choosing lots of quizzing tools, and maybe you can talk about those later on, is really helpful for taking advantage of this principle. And I say here, expect to reorient student ideas about testing. It's great to be transparent with students and say, why do we have this reading quiz? We haven't even gone over it in class. To say, hey, let me tell you about retrieval practice. And this is actually here to make sure that you've got all the important information, and then we can spend class actually talking about it. Using spacing, I think most of us have gotten pretty savvy about, hey, we can we can reach out to students even on a day when they don't have class to have them engage with the material. And pushing all those powerful kinds of processing that we know are great for memory. So asking for self-relevance, providing visuals when we can, especially things like interactive diagrams, those can be memorable as well. So those are some of the high points. We'll probably just, we'll skip the next slide because there are probably some things that'll come up in the discussion as well. But there's, for example, there's even a whole website, retrievalpractice.org, which gives tons of ideas how to use this. So I'll leave you with a few thoughts on then the application of what students are developing, the thinking side. Now, far and away, the biggest issue that comes out of all the research on how people actively use and think about what they know is transfer. So thinking skills tend to be, as we say, context specific. So I might learn about correlation and causation and be able to apply that in a narrow set of problems where I saw it in class. I might be able to use that in my psychology class. But am I going to use that same skill when I'm, say, reading my Instagram feed and somebody comes out with a claim or somebody talks about it in the press? That's the problem of transfer. And we almost always don't estimate, we overestimate how well students will be able to transfer what they know. So there's no magic bullet for transfer. I wish there were, but there isn't. But there's a few things which skilled teachers oftentimes hit upon on their own, and we can try to enhance in our teaching. So anytime that we have a focus on underlying problem structure, right? So if we want to say, okay, well, how do you tell correlation from causation? What's going on in these different kinds of problems that involve that? And then repeatedly practicing with those. So if you have students, say, looking at different scenarios and saying, is this correlation or causation? And maybe one study is about kids and another is about rats in a lab, and here's something else, it's a different kind of project. Every time you do that, that helps you then transfer that knowledge to brand new situations and ensure that you're going to be able to do that. So I've gotten to be very big on the idea of practice problems. And here's an idea to perhaps come up with to touch on later in some of the breakout discussions of what would it mean to have students really practicing those key concepts in the class across these varied different problems. What would it look like to increase that those practice problems? I know in higher education, we do a lot of content, and we don't leave space for students to actually work through those over and over. And when we do that, that means that their knowledge is going to stay pretty context bound. So that's just one kind of very choice problem within the development of thinking skills. I will say that retrieval practice is this amazing twofer. There's some suggestion from the research literature too, that when students do retrieval practice, let's say that they see correlation and causation come up on that daily quiz, they're more likely to be able to transfer that knowledge and do things like inferences and other kind of technical stuff in thinking. So yet another reason to have quizzes. So here's a few highlights of some suggestions for developing the thinking skills. Of course, it starts with us. And here too, in higher education, we've always needed to be reminded it's not all about the content. Also be reflecting on what do you need students to be able to do? You know, do you want them to be able to read their Facebook feed if they have one and say, oh, wait a minute, that research study, that doesn't sound very valid to me, or I think they're mistaking correlation and causation. If that's what you want them to be able to do, that's what they should be spending their time on in the course. Remembering that transfer of thinking skills that are being developed is just about the biggest thing, that it's going to be a big challenge in the class. So being sure that students have the opportunity to develop that mastery, trying the quizzing, and then also looking into things like those creative teaching techniques that so many people, that many people have used very effectively. Things like simulation. So maybe there's a role-playing game that students can engage in, or an activity like that. Case studies, problem-based learning, all of those provide those rich, challenging, kind of messy problem-solving environments where we know that thinking skills develop and transfer can thrive. So those are a couple of suggestions. Okay, so hopefully this has provided quite a lot of food for thought and food for discussion in the rest of your event. So I'm going to leave you just with a few questions, and I know your master teachers are going to have several more. So I'm hoping that this framework of attention, memory, thinking, and the suggestions within them, I'm hoping that that brings up in everybody at least one thing that you can do next to apply these and to extend and deepen the learning in your courses in the years to come, regardless of what modality that turns out to be. And I'd also like folks to be thinking, what surprised you the most? I mean, especially since we are a group of psychologists here and these concepts are not new, what, if anything, was surprising? What provoked that emotion of surprise, which we know can spark encoding and spark creativity? So with that, I thank you for your participation and your attention in this very, compact and rapid fire review of some of these frameworks. And we will have, I hope we'll have some good question and answer here, but I also want to encourage people very sincerely, get in touch with me if you'd like more access, if you'd like access to the Attention Matters materials, if you have any other questions, suggestions, things I missed, feel free to reach out anytime on Twitter, Facebook, shoot me an email. I really do want to hear from all of you. So thank you for all the hard work that you're putting in and all that you're accomplishing with your students and for being here today.